So it was not easy to rebel, but people did rebel. And people think, well, I'm going to rebel by taking up arms. There was a quiet rebellion, the rebellion also for dignity. So I will start with where I had planned to, but I just couldn't let that question go by. Uh, as far as the United States goes, the anti-Semitism of Breckinridge Long, who was the Assistant Secretary of State under Franklin D. Roosevelt, was a noted anti-Semite. He sent out written directions to the staff to slow it down and not give out passes to come to the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt tried to get, a small number of Jewish children to come in the United States, and that didn't happen. So the anti-Semitism in the United States was strong and real. Father Coughlin, with his radio show, didn't help. So it wasn't like we were the good guys. I have to say that in many ways, we were not the good guys. So I just want to mention the Evian conference, which the United States called in Evian, France, and they asked countries to see who would be willing to take in the Jews. And the only country, maybe 30 different countries that were there, that agreed to take in any amount of Jews was the Dominican Republic. They said they would take in 1,000 Jews, and they ended up taking in 100. But that's 100 more than any other country in the United States. Excuse me, in the world. And the United States took zero. So we have to be aware of how pervasive anti-Semitism is. Sometimes it goes underground, but then at the right time, as we have seen most recently, it arises above ground. As far as all the demonstrations and so on, these are paid for by other countries. The indoctrination of university students has been going on for a very, very, very long time. So we really do have to look at when were frankly, the Arab countries, when did they start funding the institutions of higher education, particularly the most prestigious ones? How much money have they given? And here we are. So we're in a bad place as far as that goes. As far as academic freedom, I am all for academic freedom. You are free to protest, to say whatever you want, hateful as it might be. However, you're not free to commit violence or to encourage other people to commit violence. And that's where the line has to be crossed. And that's why, from my point of view, so far, the American government has stood up and said, no, violence is too much. The increase in the rise of anti-Semitism is enormous. So now I'm going to get back to the counterpart to the Evian conference was the Wannsee conference, where they never used the word extermination, but they called it the final solution, a wonderful euphemism. So now I just want to say, whether we, from a student point of view, we're never going to remember all the names and all the dates and so on. But what we need to remember are the lessons of the Holocaust, which has to do with an opportunity for moral education, something sorely missing, lacking in American education from kindergarten on. I'm just going to say this. When I went to elementary school a very long time ago, we used to get a quotation from Poor Richard's Almanac written by Benjamin Franklin. Every day you got another one. And it was a way of teaching children, whether they had a religious background or not, how to treat other people. And I still remember the one that I was fascinated by because I was a voracious reader. And when I went to the library all the time and took out as many books as I can, I would always look at the cover to see if it was worth my looking into and seeing if I wanted to take the book home. And I still remember when we learned you cannot judge a book by its cover. So I just say that's what's missing in American education today, is there's an absence of any morality, and that's where I think we're in trouble. Okay, I did learn some lessons from my parents, so I'm going to go to the next slide, which after my if I may. Okay, these were, my mother is the taller young lady, Annie, and her sister standing in front of him, her little younger sister, her father Isaac, and mother Sophie. Annie and her father survived the Holocaust. Her mother and her little sister did not. And I will tell you, you want to talk about resistance, you'll hear in a minute. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, this was my mother's high school. They moved from their small town Oleshitsa to Yaroslav, and as a Jewish girl, this was really important for her parents to spend the money, which was hard for them, to go to high school because most kids did not. So I'm just going to read to you something that my mother said, and to give you the flavor from her mouth. She said, anti-Semitism has existed for centuries all over the world, even before the infamous Holocaust era, flaring up at different times in different places and to different degrees. In 1937-38, anti-Semitism raised its ugly head in Poland once again. Anti-Semitism was seen and felt almost everywhere, in schools and offices and factories and on streets. My city, Yaroslav, Poland, and my high school were no exception. Many neighborhoods became unsafe for Jews. If a Jew was out in the evening after dark, he was beaten, pulled by his beard, and mugged. Jewish stores were boycotted with signs at the entrance, "Don't buy from a Jew." The gymnasiums, which were high schools, and universities became battlegrounds for the Jewish and Gentile students. What may surprise you is that these fights were fueled by the faculty. In my high school, in conjunction with a discussion of the novel Lalka, the Doll, written in 1890 by a Polish journalist and novelist Boleslav Prus, even the professor fomented anti-Semitism. The subject was a comparison of Jewish life in Warsaw to the end of the 19th century and now, that is shortly before the outbreak of World War II. This discussion took place one period before my class and had turned into a shouting match and fist fight among the student body. When the same professor, Dr. Stanislav Lajechuk, who was everyone's favorite professor of history and literature, came to our class, he expressed his desire to avoid a repetition of the troublesome situation that had taken place just 1 hour earlier. He said that in order to keep, quote, peace and harmony in the class, he would give a very brief review of Jewish life and the Jew's role at the present time, meaning 37-38, and ended with, and I quote, this is my mother quoting her professor, "We, students and faculty, can't solve the Jewish problem. There are higher authorities who think about this. I, the professor, for one, would suggest that Poland shall do with the Jews what Brazil does with coffee, just dump them in the ocean," end quote. Yes, it was a great shock and disappointment to hear such a statement from him. It caused uproar in the classroom, which spread to the halls of the school, but no formal charges or even complaints were brought against the professor. There was no one to take them to and nowhere to go. My friend cried out loud, in tears and all alone. None of our Gentile friends came forward to console her. When she tried to explain the reason for her shock and outburst, the professor said, "Russia, you are too sensitive." I was outraged but quiet. Yet if looks could kill, this well-mannered and well-liked professor would have been killed instantly. This was just the beginning and never forgotten. The sad thing is that anti-Semitism is still alive, and then when she said it, said well, 60 years after the Holocaust, and even in places where there are very few and no Jews at all. And I just want you to know, my mother and I went back to her high school and we visited, and she received a medal from the school on its 70th anniversary. They showed her the yearbooks from the school. She was excited to show me pictures from her years there, but there were none. The books were missing. All the yearbooks from the Holocaust era were missing. I did see the yearbook from before the war, and there was a picture of the professor I just mentioned to you, looking like just another ordinary man. So the response varied, depended on what you could do, and there wasn't much that you could do. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Ina, could we go to the next slide?
1 second.
Okay. I would say the next slide is a photo of Witold Monchak. Okay, we'll go right after that. Do we have the next one? Okay, this I'm going to interject. My father is the second man from the left, and my uncle, his brother, is on the lower left corner. So we have David and Oscar Bleiberg, and they knew things were coming. This was before the war in their small town of Oleshitsa. The young fighting men, you can see, without rifles or ammunition. Ultimately, my father, I believe, got a revolver, but this is the fighting force. Okay, so that should give you an idea. They weren't going quietly or silently or anything like that. Okay, next photo, please. Next slide. Okay, this is Helga Futowska. She's a righteous Christian. And my mother and the next slide of Witold Monchak had not seen each other in over 50 years since before the war. And so Witold was the mayor's son in her small town of Oleszyce. And they did amazing things, which I'll tell you about momentarily. But the question I want you to say to you and ask yourself is, would you put your own life and your family's life at risk to save a neighbor or a friend? You don't have to answer that. I never want to be put in that position. But you want to talk about bystanders or people turning their head the other way. You don't know what you're going to do until you're in that situation. I can tell you other stories that I didn't know that I would do certain things, but we don't have time for that. My point is, I don't want to judge anybody for turning away. They were afraid. And the people who did stick their neck out should be rewarded and applauded. Okay, go to the next slide, please. Okay, I went too far. Let me just tell you a little bit about Helga Futowski. Okay, her family, the Jews were not allowed to own property at a certain point, in Poland. And so her family bought the property from the Polish nobleman that actually had been a Roosevelt nobleman in the area, and they bought it because they could buy it. They then gave the money, the land to my father's father, the Bleiberg family. There was no written documents. There was no nothing. All of it was illegal, but it was the Bleiberg family land. Um, People did what they thought was right. So the question is, why did they do it? So I want to tell you about Helka. I'll start with, both my parents were sent to a ghetto when they left their small town. They were sent to the ghetto of Lobachov. It was called an open ghetto, so my father was able to get away. My mother, on the other hand, was taken by the train with her father and her mother and her sisters, you saw in that photograph. Her father, because of Witold, and Witold was the mayor's son, was able to get word to them. Her father was able to take a crowbar and a hammer and so on with them. They took the boards off the cattle car and they jumped off the moving train. And the last thing my mother remembers, as she says, was the feeling of her mother's hands under her, as she said, buttocks, as she jumped over the train and she was told to roll over and then walk in the opposite direction of the train. So the two of them were able to do that. There was shooting all around them. Um, as it Luck is a huge part. As my mother said, she was the first of the girls online, but the young man who was the last one online, he became afraid. And he said to my mother, "You jump ahead of me, I'll go after you." My mother survived. The young man who jumped afterwards was killed. So luck is an important aspect of anything you do. You never know if it's going to be the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Witold was able to get false identity papers. He was part of the underground in Poland, did this for a number of Jewish women, was able to get false identity papers for my mother. While she was on the train, planning to go to Germany as a Polish worker girl, I remember it was much easier for girls to escape than boys because they couldn't be identified so readily. She was identified instead by a classmate as a Jew. She was pulled off the train and then taken. Unfortunately, she was pulled off the train near Krakow because had she been closer to Yaroslav, she would have been, or Oleszyce, she would have been shot on the spot. But because it was closer to Krakow, she ended up in the Plaszow jail, which, if you saw Schindler's List, you know what that looks like. From the Plaszow jail, when that was liquidated, she was taken to Auschwitz. She didn't see her father till the end of the war. But the point is that people rebelled as best as they could. As far as my father goes, he was taken to the work camp in the Ukraine, Yanovska. His mother bribed the guard, and he was in the cell. And I always, as a little kid, thought of him as Superman because there was one cell with iron bars, in this room. And he asked his mother for a clean shirt. She gave him the shirt and he twisted it around the bars and spread them far enough apart so he could jump out of the cell and run away and was never recaptured. So you want to talk about rebellion and doing what you can with what you had. it wasn't easy. So don't assume that everybody went like sheep. A lot of people did what they could, but there wasn't much that they could do. So, okay, let's go back now to the slides and what I could talk about in terms of lessons learned. One of them, one of that's Helga. That was right after her husband died in her home. This was the obituary for my mother in Newsday, which was appeared on September 11th. How fitting, 2018. They did a full one-page story. That's the two of them on their wedding day. Okay, next, please. Okay, these are the lessons I learned from my parents. Obvious lessons, many lessons: do not be prejudiced, because the reality is that if non-Jews, Polish and Ukrainians, I might add, which I didn't even get to, were not willing to risk their own life and their family's life, nobody would have survived. Be mentally and emotionally strong. It's very hard to stand up to hatred the way that seek out the truth. Another reason that people didn't think that they were going to be killed was perhaps a failure of imagination. There'd been programs, but never this kind of killings at this level. And of course, if you look at the gate to Auschwitz, it said Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. They all thought, if I can only work, if I still stay healthy and work, then I'll survive. Not necessarily. Okay. Having the will to endure. Okay, then we go on to next slide, please. Is there a next slide?
No, that's it.
That's the last slide. Okay, then I will just tell you about them. Seek out the truth. As I said, the newspapers did nothing to help, including the New York Times, which buried all of the articles about the Holocaust in the middle of the back pages. And finally, be optimistic and keep a positive attitude. My mother had this saying, "Man muss aushalten, durchhalten, überhalten," which in German are very nice ways of saying, if you have a mountain, you can go over the mountain, through the mountain, or around the mountain, but keep going. And you will survive. She had many stories about how she was able to do this, including her dreams and the strength that she believed that she got from her grandfather and from her parents. They said, "You're strong." And she always said, by the way, that her education really helped her out because she knew lots of languages. And so she could understand a little bit earlier what was going on. And I would say the most important thing is, my parents lost their families. They lost everything they had. As my mother said, she didn't get a dowry, but her mother said, "Your education is your dowry. Nobody can take that from you." And that was true. So the answer is, get a good education. And that means not just academically, but morally. And they started over from nothing, and with nothing. And when I was born in Germany, and when we came here, everybody said to my mother, "Don't speak that awful language to her." She doesn't know any other language. So she spoke German to me. I never learned Polish, but I did learn German. Um, it's hard. It's hard, I will tell you, and I know this always concerned her, that as a Jewish family, how do you help your children not be ashamed that they're Jewish, not to feel, as the stories went around over and over, that the Jews were led like sheep to their slaughter, that they should be proud of what they have accomplished. So as an adult, that's much easier. As a child, when you get all these subtle and not so subtle signals, which frankly, I can tell you lots of stories about that as well, if we had more time, about a Black young man in my class, and how mistreated he was, frankly, by the teachers. So the one thing I will say is that I always wondered who would be so ignorant, who would be so prejudiced. And the answer is, one, it's learned, and the two, from a social psychological perspective, it's so much easier to go along with the crowd than to stand up to the crowd. And that, I think, explains a lot of what the young people on campuses are doing now. They are being manipulated, and they don't have the inner strength to take a stand that might be unpopular. Perhaps they'll regret it, but frankly, it's up to us as adults to hold the people in power accountable. And frankly, I am very pleased pleased that President Trump decided to threaten the universities by withholding funds, because obviously that's all they understand. I wish it weren't that way. I truly wish it weren't that way. I'm a sociologist by training. My heart, circumstances have made me change my mind and rethink a lot of things, because we live in a different world than we did before October 7th. So with that, I'll end right here and be happy to take any questions. Thank you.